Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Friends, I hope you'll remain friends after my speech. Well, the focus of this timely conference is on export development. There's very little I know about the kinds of details which I've been, listening to, which are very important, and I applaud the organizers certainly, and then Mrs. Francis for having done this enormously important conference, because it's central to development. Nothing is ever the only game in town. There are a number of things you have to do, a package of reforms, a package of policies. So often people will say, oh, trade is not important. And I say, and then often they say, but these other things were equally important. And I said, that's putting up a straw man. Or it's called, putting up an Aunt Sally. You can take your choice depending on your gender preference. But it is essentially not, I see at least one distinguished trade economist here, that's not what we argue, that it's the only thing to do. And there are also supportive policies which we need to have. So anyway, it is a very important topic. And basically, the way we think about it is in terms of market access, which is really what the trade negotiations like WTO often are about, getting access to other people's markets. And they're also about denying access to other people to your markets, unfortunately, sometimes. But that's on the cynical side. So it's a market access focused thing. Now, it's pretty obvious, therefore, that we would think, not just economists, but everybody else, it's common sense, that you would think in terms of the problem really residing in Brussels, in Washington, in Tokyo, hopeless as it sounds, those are the areas where market access to the developed countries is involved. Of course, we also recognize there's South-South trade, so there's a corollary there. But it's market access in terms of other people's trade barriers. But now you have to go beyond simple economics, and then we go on to the next intermediate lesson, and we say our own protectionism can also be a problem in getting market access. That sounds paradoxical, and economists like paradoxes, sometimes just because they're paradoxes, and sometimes because they have an important insight for policy purposes. This is of the second type. So think of an analogy. You're opening your door, right, which means you're lowering your trade barriers. And I want to exploit that opportunity. But if my door is not open, I can't get past my door, right, and I can't get to your door. So you may do everything under the sun to open your door, reduce your subsidies, reduce your trade barriers, but it's not enough because my own policies at home, protectionist policies, may undermine you. Now, when you see infrastructure, you see it right away, because that doesn't need any sophisticated economics, because if you have potholes rather than roads, you may not be able to get to the ports, to be able to put things on ships, and so on, to be able to ship, hopefully send corn and other things and cotton, etc., to United States and EU. So that part is easy to see, though there the economics gets very complicated because you can also have infrastructure built and nothing happening on it. I was once in a Mercedes-Benz when I used to be treated well, going up the road from Kathmandu to the Chinese border. And this had been built for 5 years, and aside from a couple of yaks, we didn't see anything. So that didn't lead to massive growth and so on. So it's like the Kevin Costner film, Field of Dreams. Just building a baseball field doesn't bring anything about. In my opinion, we have to be careful about, of course, you need infrastructure for exports, but you also have to be very careful that you just don't build things which are simply not used. And this is where you really, I think, taking my country of origin, India, you see that until mid-80s when we had very bad policies, including autarkic, inward-looking policies, not taking trade into account, and lots of other things. Nobody ever complained of infrastructure because nobody needed it. Once we started growing very rapidly, then the demand grows, and now we are talking about infrastructure all the time, okay? So in a way, you want to make sure that you don't put the cart before the horse, right? Because otherwise, the horse may die. because if people see aid is being wasted, even though it's called aid for trade, be sure that there are lots of piranhas out there who want to kill aid. And so you've got to be just very careful. But that's just a side thing. Let me come to the more sophisticated way as to why we economists have come to feel that our protectionism in the developing countries is also a problem. And the reason why it's a problem is because of what we call bias against exports. When you have protected markets, you make the domestic market more profitable relative to export markets. Countless numbers of studies, in one of which Letterman also participated, show that this bias against exports is a very important thing to worry about. And this is based on several country studies. At one time it was a theoretical point, but it is now widely accepted. So when we have people coming and telling us in the developing countries, you should maintain your protection, right? The problem is in Brussels and in Washington. I said send them back to the universities in the West where they come from and say ruin your own country, not ours, right? Because that's exactly ignoring the important lesson which we've got, which is that our own protectionism also needs to be tamed, reduced, and so on. So that's the first point. So therefore, if you have fear of trade, and the title of my talk, the way it can affect you is if the fear of trade prevents you from reducing your own trade barriers, and if the fear of trade prevents the other people from opening their doors, like in Brussels and Washington. So at both ends, we need to worry about protectionist sentiments. Now, sentiments frequently tend to be disproportionate to the actions. So we also should not get too alarmist about it. The bark is usually more fierce than the bite. So fear of trade, at both ends, I think there is something in the air about this. And actually, I'm going to talk a little bit about economists and what we think in terms of contributing to this atmospherics, rather than what we know from the actual politics, particularly in the developed countries. Yesterday I gave a talk at the WTO, and Pascal Lamy was there, and there's going to be an article in the FT on that subject as to how the media hype is there about how the consensus on free trade among economists is breaking down in the United States and elsewhere. So that's a developed country problem which is compounding the protectionism which you're getting at the political end. Because whenever you go and tell the Democrats, for example, who are all anxious and hostile to trade or skeptical of trade, they say, but Professor Bhagwati, and they say that to everybody who goes and talks to them, saying, you no longer have a consensus view, so you're just one of them, right, on one side, and there are other people on the other side. So this is media hype, actually, because if you go and actually examine it, it's not true. We do have a fair degree of consensus on it, but there'll be an FT article which summarizes the basic argument as to why these kinds of media hypes, which are feeding into protectionism, which is coming from a variety of political reasons, is actually a threat for us, for the developing countries, because it is important that their doors should be open. Don't forget that. Now I come to our side as to, I'm putting on my Indian hat, of course. I get confused when I'm talking about Americans or about Indians. So I'll always specify which side I'm talking about when I say we. But the developing countries also have to worry about it. And we have our own problematic attacks on what we have learned. So let me just take a little backwards glance at what we have learned. Because this is, again, a replay of an old story. Because when I was I'm talking about 50 years ago, because I'm 73, and I was just starting doing planning in India on the problems of poverty and how to grow rapidly and to pull people up into gainful employment. Not trickle down, which suggests you're having a great meal and there are dogs and poor people in the bottom, like in some of these Hollywood movies about Robin Hood and so on and so forth. So that's a trickle down. Something just trickles down because, you're eating so much and then something goes down, and that's what the poor get. Well, we were using growth as a way of pulling people up. So it's a more activist image, pull up, not trickle down. And we were interested in a variety of policies, mainly growth inducing policies, because common sense and economics do go together once in a while. And a growing economy is a necessary condition to create jobs and employment and therefore pull people out of poverty. It may not do very much, but you really would find it very difficult to prove that a stagnant economy will do better. All right? Anything can be proven in economics. You know, you just have to be smart enough to make the right assumptions and arrive at conclusions, whichever ones you want, and preferably put into algebra so nobody understands. But then that can be a big problem. But leaving such complications aside, it is common sense that a growing economy is more likely to produce jobs and reduce poverty, and that's already happened in India. So at one time, there was great skepticism about it, because there's always, and I'm talking of 50s and 60s in particular. So there were two kinds of arguments, and I'll link it up now very quickly with what people are worried about now. So I'll take just another 10, 15 minutes. One is, historically, the prevalent view in sort of economic, philosophical, and political terms was that the economic argument that things like trade and investment would be mutually beneficial, mutual gain theory, was actually wrong when you had poor countries, developing countries, coexisting in international integration in the same international markets with rich countries. It sounds a bit of a joke now, because today, our workers were saying, and our policymakers, how can we at our low wages, people who are not been eating steak from the age of 2, having to compete with people in the, who are much better built out there because they've had better nutrition, they've got more technology, more capital. How could we ever compete with those guys? Today it's turned around and they say, how can we, compete with these poor guys? Right? So it's kind of a joke, actually, at one level, when you think about it. But in those days, the notion that poor countries could coexist to mutual advantage in international integration was a very mind-numbing thought, and the mind was numbed so you couldn't think as a result, you see. So because it was a fright. There was conventional economic argument also. So this was the unconventional, meaning on the philosophical level, more or less, saying we cannot have integration without national disintegration. And the most important one was, because this was all at the level of the elites, I would say, but then it came to policy making, and then policy making was based on pessimism about international trade. So we were talking international trade. And that was two forms. One was called export pessimism, meaning you start exporting, and Brussels and Washington will cut you off at your knees. As soon as you succeed, they'll close the markets, because it's protectionism, basically. It can arise in several forms, as we know, anti-dumping, all sorts of actions. Rules become important. They may just simply raise barriers because the bound tariffs are above the current level, so they don't even have to go to the GATT and so on. They can just raise it. So there are a variety of ways in which, and then they can intimidate you also, right? Like they were intimidating Costa Rica over the weekend and saying, if you don't sign the FTA, then we are going to deprive you of your GSP and CBI, right? So that's a threat, right? So you better fall into shape, fall on your knees, right? Because otherwise we'll do unspeakable things to you. Okay, so it can arise at a variety of levels, but that was the fear that the developed countries then came to actually importing different lobbies, and people will use power and the existing possibilities to deny you those markets and to stop it. So that was a fear. That was called export pessimism, because that's when you start exporting and you lose, meaning you can't sustain it. The second was called elasticity pessimism, which was also a form of export pessimism. It was not about man-made protectionism, but it was about the natural condition of the markets. So if you sat down in the Planning Commission and said, how much more jute can I export if you're in Bangladesh? Or if you're in India and say how much more cotton textiles you can export, then you would say, well, particularly if you're bureaucrats or economists, because you're not in business, right? We would say, good God, there's no way I can really have a massive export performance. So you become pessimistic about exports. And you don't see the exports which can develop when the prices are right, when the prices are favorable. And the most important experience we have in the post-war world is that while bureaucrats and economists can't think of what will be exported at suitable prices when the incentives are right, huge numbers of people come out of everywhere and respond to this, and all kinds of what used to be called miscellaneous exports become very important. So my old Cambridge teacher, Nicky Caldor, infant industry protection was another one, that we needed infant industry protection. Now we have now so many examples of infants who have grown into senility still with diapers on. And the conditions under which, infant industry protection works. But when used as a general formula, like we had in, what was it, Article 12? Or we have in the GATT one article. Article 18 is on balance of payments, which I won't spend time on. But, and there we have it. But the point is, no one has ever found any decent criterion for saying that is an industry we ought to protect. So we've had like 50 years of tariff protection in many countries, developing countries, including in Africa. So isn't it time for us to say, look, maybe this doesn't work? And the basic problem we have is being able to identify ex ante what is in fact an infant industry deserving of support, because the theoretical argument is quite solid. It goes back to John Stuart Mill almost 200 years ago. We now have what I call Jurassic Park economics on the part of some. They're trying to revive these monsters which we had slain, I thought, but their DNA survives, particularly in the writings of a few people on whom I'm writing a paper. One is my former friend Danny Roderick, my present colleague Joe Stiglitz. Then there is a historian called Chang, a Korean who is at the Department of Applied Economics. I think we're both Cambridge people. And he cites historical experience. And then there is Robert Wade, who is an anthropologist at London School of Economics, again, another good friend. And every time somebody writes anything in favor of free trade, there's always a letter in the Financial Times saying, this is not true. And so there are four, so I'm tempted to call them the Gang of Four, but there are definable people who are actually very skeptical of trade. Now, you can go through these things. I don't know how much influence they have. I think they have influence particularly with people who don't have their own skilled manpower to be able to say this doesn't make sense. So they do have, they have a populist appeal with some countries, but I would not exaggerate it. At least I've never been able to debate them, certainly not my friend Professor Stiglitz. In countries like mine, in India and so on, the effect, an overwhelming number of countries was a goofing off because people got settled in their home markets. They had, access to their own governments, and they never really grew up. So like in at the time before we changed our policies in the mid-80s, the car industry was pathetic in India. And there was a Tariff Commission report on cars. And the judge said, in an Indian car, everything makes a noise except the horn. And so there was no competition. None at all. Today there's so much competition. And it's really, now we're beginning to export actually in a big way. And invent, new cars and so on and so forth, Tatas, etc. So it's a different world. So competition really helps. So if you say, look, I'm going to be able to tell my system, my infants, as it were, give them a degree of protection in the first phase. But then within 10 years, you've got to be swimming right in the world with the piranhas and so on, whatever. Then it really puts them on guard. When you take Korea and the Far Eastern economies, you're not old enough. I'm 73, so I remember. South Korea in particular was a bunch of hamlets. Nobody ever expected them to become what they did. And there was no particular protection, etc. in those days. So they still went ahead. And look at how fiercely, successful they've been. They built up their exports and so on. GSP came much later, towards the end of the 60s. So GSP didn't help them. They just decided they wanted to export and settle down to business. And they've made the industries compete internationally. And it worked out. So I think those kinds of things really, when you look at it, the reason for revival of this defeatism that we cannot export and that we need infant industry protection, if you go by all the arguments that you can produce, I've been doing a proper analysis of, of each of those statements, I would say, caveat emptor, don't buy this rubbish, right? Because we have ample experience. We can do well through international trade. And in my book on globalization, there's a whole chapter on how much evidence there is, actually, empirical evidence, that trade does promote development.